Welcome again. We got off to a good start last night with our fiery talk, fine talk by Lou Dobbs. He pulled no punches as usual. And I think he set the stage for us for our panel this morning on globalization, the pros and cons of globalization. To discuss this topic, much in the news, we have assembled a distinguished panel. And what I'd like to do is introduce all three of them right now, and then they will take the podium one at a time. Clyde Prestowitz is the founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute. He holds a BA from Swarthmore College, an MA from the East-West Center of the University of Hawaii, and an MBA from the Wharton Graduate School of Business. He served as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration, where he headed U.S. negotiations with a number of foreign countries, and he was a leader of the first U.S. trade mission to China. He writes for several publications, including Fortune, Foreign Affairs, and the Straits Times. He is the author of several books, including The Betrayal of American Prosperity, Free Market Delusions, America's Decline, and How We Must Compete in the Post-Dollar Era. Daniel Griswold, sitting here to my right, is Senior Research Fellow and Co-Director of the Program on the American Economy and Globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and a master's in the politics of the world economy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has previously served as president of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones and as Director of Trade and Immigration Studies for the Cato Institute. He has testified before various congressional committees, and he is the author of numerous studies and articles. He is also the author of the book, Mad About Trade: Why Main Street America Should Embrace Globalization. And lastly, but not least, Jeff Ferry, sitting here to my left, is Research Director at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where his research and analysis focuses on trade and industrial policies and the promotion of American economic growth. He has degrees in economics from Harvard and the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has extensive experience as an economist, a financial and technology journalist, and a technology executive. He has written for numerous publications, including The Washington Post and Forbes magazine, and also for Bloomberg News. In addition, he has produced documentaries on business for the BBC and other British television broadcasters. He is the author of the book, The British Renaissance. And with that, since we are still missing Mr. Prestowitz, I will ask Dan Griswold to speak first. Dan.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Hillsdale College, for sponsoring this economic forum, this free market forum. I'm a great fan of Hillsdale College and its service not only to its students, but to America and the cause of liberty over the years. And it's great to be in Texas, here in Texas. I have a few things in common with people in Texas, a love of good barbecue and free enterprise. I admire the resiliency of the people in the state, whether it's to wild swings in the price of oil or hurricanes that drop 50 inches of rain. And what a great place to talk about free trade and globalization. As in so many other areas, Texas is #1 in states in terms of international trade in exports to the rest of the world. More than 1 million jobs in Texas depend directly on exporting to other countries. And the #1 market for exports from Texas is Mexico. Whether it's natural gas going through new pipelines, beef, cotton, semiconductors, airplanes, Mexico is your #1 market. And another 500,000 Texans work for foreign-owned affiliates in Texas, which is another area of globalization. You're going to hear a lot about globalization how to define it. I see it as basically the increasingly free movement of goods, services, capital, people across international borders. And despite what you hear from some people, globalization is not a top-down phenomenon. It's what happens when people in America and around the world are left free by their governments to do business with one another. It's spontaneous order. It's what Adam Smith called the natural system of liberty. Free trade means more competition to provide you and me with goods and services that make our lives better, to provide those at lower cost, more variety, better quality. Think of automobiles, shoes, clothing, food, electronics. And the greatest proportional benefits go to low-income households, single parents, who spend a higher share of their budget on tradable items like clothing, footwear, and food. And the savings that we realize from lower-priced imports means we have more to spend on domestically provided goods and services like education, entertainment, housing, eating out. And imports are critical to American producers who utilize global supply chains. More than half of what we import each year to the United States are not things for consumption, but for production. Capital goods, raw materials, intermediate components. If American companies can source globally for their inputs, that leads to lower priced final products, more competitive products in domestic and foreign markets. And of course, free trade means lower barriers around the world to U.S. exports. 80% of the world's spending power, 95% of the world's people live outside the United States. American companies need to sell in global markets if they are going to survive and thrive in the 21st century. Let me just tackle a couple of myths that I think you'll hear a little bit about this morning. It's a myth that trade has somehow decimated our manufacturing base. America remains an industrial and manufacturing powerhouse in the global economy. Our manufacturing sector, year after year, produces more than $2 trillion in value added. It's near a record high. Real manufacturing output in the last 25 years is up more than 40%. We are leading or among the world's leaders in manufacturing civilian aircraft, appliances, motor vehicles, microprocessors, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, petroleum, refined petroleum products, of which Texas is a leader. And despite what you might hear about the beleaguered domestic steel industry, we remain the world's fourth largest steel producer. You'll also hear about jobs and trade. Job losses in manufacturing are not primarily because of trade, but because of technology. A recent study from Ball State University looked at the years 2000 to 2010, and in that decade, we lost a net 5.6 million manufacturing jobs. But they found that 85% of those job losses were not from trade, but from productivity gains fueled by technology and innovation. The right response to job losses is not to raise trade barriers. It's to prepare ourselves and our children for the jobs that are being created in our modern economy, to improve education, retraining, labor market mobility. We need to prepare our workforce for the jobs of today and tomorrow, not try to bring back the jobs of yesterday. Trade agreements have proven to be the most effective way to reduce barriers to U.S. exports around the world. They've kept trade barriers down even in difficult times. They've helped us avoid the destructive trade wars that we suffered in the 1930s. And here's where I have to take a polite issue with our speaker last night. One of our most successful trade deals is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Withdrawing from NAFTA would be a colossal blunder for the state of Texas and the nation as a whole. By every reasonable measure, NAFTA has been a success. Since its passage, two-way trade among the NAFTA countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, has more than tripled to over $1 trillion. Canada and Mexico are now our top two export markets, buying 34% of U.S. exports. NAFTA has delivered the level playing field that our politicians always tell us they want. Before NAFTA, Mexico had much higher tariffs on U.S. exports going to Mexico than we had on Mexican imports coming into the United States. NAFTA has reduced duties in all directions to zero. What could be more fair than that? As a result, North American production and capital markets are highly integrated, making the automobile sector and others very competitive in global markets. I agree with your Texas controller who said recently the biggest loser in tearing up NAFTA and throwing it in the trash really would be Texas, because we are an export state. In the past 30 years, we've entered free trade agreements with 20 countries. In a big study that was released last summer, the U.S. International Trade Commission, that's a quasi-independent trade body in Washington, they studied those agreements and the economic effect they've had on the U.S. economy, and here was their conclusion. Those agreements have increased two-way trade with FTA partner countries in goods and services by 26% over what it would be otherwise. They have boosted U.S. economic output and employment. They've delivered higher real wages and lower prices and more product variety for millions of American households. And they've actually increased our ability to collect on intellectual property from abroad by $10 billion a year. We're collecting $10 billion or more a year because of trade agreements. Well, in contrast to the blessings of free trade, government protection through higher trade barriers is really just another form of central planning. It's the government intervening in the economy to stifle competition. It's a conspiracy to raise prices at the expense of the majority of American citizens. Protection has left in its wake coddled industries and political cronyism. As one economist, Doug Irwin, said in the Wall Street Journal recently, protectionism isn't draining the swamp, it created the swamp, in part through all the lobbying for special protection. Protection is not about America first. It's about sticking it to certain groups of Americans for the benefit of other smaller groups of politically connected producers, and leaving our nation as a result weaker and poorer. A textbook case for what's wrong with U.S. protection is the U.S. steel industry. Decade after decade, the steel industry has sought special protection from Washington against its foreign competition. Now the Trump administration is actually weighing broad tariffs on imported steel, all in the name of national security. I think that would also be a huge mistake. The Trump administration blames the woes of the steel industry that I think are exaggerated. They blame them on imports and the problems with manufacturing generally on imports, which we've seen isn't the case. The decline of jobs in the steel industry, when you look at it, has nothing to do with imports. The primary driver of declining employment in the steel industry is soaring productivity, which is a good thing, I was taught when I studied economics, fueled by automation and changing steel production methods, and also the declining demand for steel in our more high-tech 21st century economy. Consider the fact that if you go back to the 1970s, and I remember the 1970s, U.S. steel consumption per capita was almost double what it is today. Back in the 70s, on average, Americans consumed about 1,400 pounds of steel a year. Today, that's down to 741 pounds. So despite the growth of our economy and our population, we're actually consuming less steel as a nation today than we were in the 1970s. And imports back then made up about 20% of our consumption. It's 21% today, so that really hasn't changed. Meanwhile, the productivity of the domestic steel industry has really gone through the roof, and this is a great story for the steel industry. Back in the 1970s, it took about 10 man-hours to produce a ton of steel. Today, it takes less than 2 man-hours, and at some of the newer mini-mills, it takes less than a man-hour to produce a ton of steel. Lower demand, lower overall demand, rising productivity, it's kind of simple math. It guarantees that there will be fewer jobs, significantly fewer jobs in the industry. That's why imposing duties on imported steel will do nothing to bring back jobs to Youngstown, Ohio, and other steel producing areas. Imposing duties on imported steel will actually weaken the U.S. manufacturing base. Why? Because there are a lot more companies and workers who depend on imported steel as an input to their production process than actually make steel. The steel industry itself in America today actually employs only about 140,000 workers. But if you look at steel consuming industries, they employ more than 6 million American workers. So for every job that's supposedly saved or protected in the steel industry by higher tariffs, there are 40 jobs of our fellow Americans who are put at risk by those. Hardest hit would be the construction industry and the automobile industry. Together, they consume about 2/3 of the steel in the United States each year. Other key industries that consume steel are machinery and equipment, energy, and appliances. Higher steel prices because of tariffs would drive up the cost of domestic steel. We'd become a kind of island of high steel prices in the global economy that would raise the price of production, the cost of production, and the final price of their goods for these industries, reducing sales at home and abroad. And of course, reduced sales would translate into destroying more jobs, actually destroying more jobs in the steel using industries than they would protect in the steel industry itself. And steel tariffs would jeopardize U.S. exports. If the United States wraps itself in the flag of national security to protect its domestic steel industry, other countries are going to do the same. They're going to raise tariffs, not just on U.S. steel, but on a broad range of goods. Tariffs will go up against key American exports, from computers to soybeans, disrupting even more U.S. jobs. You know, we had a protectionist experiment in this country, and some people actually look back kind of fondly on that era. I wasn't around then, but my parents were. America's protectionist experiment reached a kind of crescendo in 1930 with the passage of the SmootHawley Tariff Act. The bill raised duties on thousands of items, manufactured goods, agricultural commodities. The results of the bill were disastrous. Instead of reviving domestic industry, the bill spurred retaliatory tariffs from our major trading partners, including Canada. Both U.S. exports and imports plummeted in the wake of SmootHawley. Now, SmootHawley didn't cause the Great Depression, but it didn't alleviate it either. In fact, it deepened and prolonged the Great Depression and the suffering of the American people. After World War II, in a bipartisan way, American leaders made a monumental decision to turn away from America first, inward-looking protectionism of the 1930s and to engage and lead in the global economy, to set a good example, to sign international agreements, starting with a general agreement on tariffs and trade, on through the World Trade Organization and various regional and bilateral agreements. In the 7 decades since then, our post-war trade policy has delivered competition, innovation, better paying jobs, and more freedom for the American people. But beyond our borders, it has also helped, and we need to care about this just as people and as humanitarians, it has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. In fact, in the world today, the number of people living in absolute poverty, according to the World Bank, has fallen in the last 25 years by 1 billion people. 1 billion fewer people living in absolute poverty and enjoying something like the middle-class lives that we all take for granted. There's a number of reasons behind that, but one of the primary reasons is the spread of globalization, of global capitalism, of which we have played a role. And this was a motivation of Secretary of State Cordell Hull under FDR, who was an architect of our move towards freer trade. It has helped to preserve the peace among the Western powers after 2 devastating world wars. Free trade and globalization have made America stronger and more prosperous, while helping to create a more hospitable world in our national interests. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to start with a parable story. It seems that there was a hiker, and he was arrested for killing and eating a California condor. Condors are protected birds. You're not supposed to kill them. You're not supposed to eat them. And so eventually this hiker was brought to court, and the prosecutor threw the book at him. It was open and shut, it appeared, because the guy had killed and eaten the condor, and he admitted he had killed and eaten the condor. So the prosecutor asked for the maximum sentence, a life imprisonment. And before issuing the sentence, the judge turned to the hiker and he said, looks pretty bad for you, but do you have anything to say? The hiker said, yeah, I do, Judge. He said, look, it was like this. There were extenuating circumstances. Said, I had been hiking for 3 days and 3 nights without food or water. I was getting to the point of starvation, and I happened to see this bird sitting on a rock. I picked up a stone, threw it, killed it, ate it, and then I walked for 3 more days and 3 more nights without food or water before reaching civilization. If I hadn't killed that bird, I wouldn't be here today to tell the story. And the judge said, well, those really were unusual circumstances. And in light of those circumstances, he would issue a suspended sentence. So the judge hit his mallet against the block and said, court dismissed. And everyone began to leave the courtroom. The hiker began to leave. But just as the hiker was about to leave the room, the judge called to him. And he said, by the way, what did that condor taste like? And the hiker paused for a moment. He said, well, I'll tell you the truth, Judge. It was kind of between a spotted owl and and so, you know, clearly the judge and the excuse me, the jury and the hiker had a different concept of how the law was supposed to be applied and how it was being applied. And so let me take a moment to explain the similarity between the condor and the eating hiker and our situation today. Globalization is nothing new. It's been around for essentially the span of human existence. Christopher Columbus, whose statues many cities are now trying to take down, was in fact a great globalist. Discovered the New World, put Asia, or put the Americas and Europe together, and led to a huge global round of shrinking the globe. The British Empire of the late 18th and 19th centuries was a machine of globalization, creation of colonies, Australia, the colonization of India, Africa, of the Americas, all tied together in the British Empire, created, of course, enormous international flows of trade. Indeed, it was the Boston Tea Party was a protest against some aspects of globalization under the British Empire. The 19th century was really a century of globalization. Interestingly, the United States participated in a halfway manner. We exported, indeed in the 19th century, the U.S. acted very much as China is acting today. It protected its domestic markets. The U.S. was a protectionist, mercantilist economy throughout most of the 19th century, really until the end of World War II. Abraham Lincoln has been called the great emancipator, but you could call him the great protector. He raised American tariffs higher than they had ever been in the 1860s. By the beginning of the First World War, the world's economy was more globalized, more integrated than it would be again for almost 100 years. Indeed, the globalization of the early 1900s was fascinating. You didn't need a passport to travel. You didn't have to worry about exchange rates. Gold was the world's money. And indeed, goods and services flowed, particularly investment, flowed dramatically in the early 20th century. In 1912, Norman Angell, a famous British author, wrote a book called The Grand Illusion. And the argument of the book was that the major countries were so integrated. UK, France, Germany were all each other's major trading partners. And the argument was that they were so integrated that war would be unthinkable. Well, of course, in 1914, we found that war was not unthinkable. And as I said, the world would not reach the level of 1914's globalization until about 1994. The U.S., as I said, was a protectionist, mercantilist power. The U.S. got rich as a mercantilist, protectionist economy. But at the end of World War II, we faced a situation in which the rest of the world was in ruins. And the U.S. was competitive in virtually every industry. And partly in order to enable world economic recovery, and partly because as a result of being the most competitive industry in almost every industry, the U.S. had faced great potential opportunities through the lowering of tariffs and through achieving free trade. The United States led a restructuring of the global economy. And so in the late 1940s, we implemented what is known as the program to liberalize essentially the entire global economy. So we established the International Monetary Fund, we established the World Bank, and what's known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And those institutions governed the global economy and still do. The GATT has become the World Trade Organization, but those are the fundamental organizations that have overseen the revitalization of globalization over the past 70 years. Interestingly, the establishment of that system was initially created essentially on the basis of the widely accepted neoclassical theory of international economics. And under that theory, it was argued that countries would maximize their welfare by reducing their tariffs and by concentrating on what they made best and importing the rest. Now, that system was based on a number of assumptions. One of the assumptions was that there would be no movement of technology or of people between economies. Another assumption was that exchange rates would be fixed and not necessarily be the gold standard, but we had a system in which all global currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar acted as the world's money, as a kind of a substitute gold standard. And the status of the global economy, in a rough way, met the conditions of those assumptions. So trade in the late, or let's say the 1950s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, was largely in commodities in which there were very large markets and no single producer had enough production to affect the final price or the amount of total global production. We had the dollar as a kind of stable global currency with a tie to gold. And I would say between, let's say, 1945 and 1972, we saw a free trade system that operated roughly as it would be expected to operate under the reigning doctrines of international economic theory. And we saw enormous growth, both globally and in the United States. In the U.S., the GDP per capita nearly tripled in that time period. This was the golden age of the American economy. But difficulties arose in the system as other countries recovered, as Germany recovered, Japan recovered, and others from the devastation of the war. They began to become competitive in a range of manufacturing and technology industries. And many of them began to operate their economies in ways that were at odds with the assumptions of international economic theory and at odds with the intent of the Bretton Woods organizations that had been established in the late 1940s. The United States began to experience trade deficits. The U.S. had been a trade surplus country since the mid-19th century. But after 1972, the U.S. began to experience large and rising trade deficits. And so in response to a lot of those developing imbalances and problems, President Nixon took the U.S. economy off of took the dollar off of the tie to gold. John Connally, the Texas Secretary of Commerce, former Texas governor, famously commented to a group of Europeans. He said, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." And what he meant by that was that the dollar was not going to be pegged to gold. It was going to float. The value of the dollar would be determined by market forces, and the dollar would float up or down according to how market forces push it. And the immediate impact was that the dollar devalued, and many of the countries who were competitors of the U.S. in the global market took a hit. Their exports dropped, and they were less competitive than they had been before the dollar was floating. If I could pause just a minute and get a water. Excuse me, thank you. Now, in this new regime, let's look at the period between 1972 and let's say 2001. And this is the period when when globalization expanded dramatically, but so at the same time did concerns and imbalances and disruptions occur in the global economy. And so we saw increasing trade friction between the U.S. and a number of other countries, but particularly, initially, we had trade frictions with Germany in the early 1970s as German exports, particularly of automobiles and of steel, began to make big inroads in the U.S. markets. But then we particularly began to have issues with Japan. I know something about these issues because in that period I was counselor to the Secretary of Commerce, and I was the chief U.S. negotiator with Japan. And I can tell you that it seemed like every morning I went to work, I had a new issue on my desk. It would be steel, it would be semiconductors, it would be telecommunications equipment, it would be automobiles, it could be almonds. I mean, just one industry after another complaining that it was having a problem in Japan. And the problem always was that the Japanese market was very difficult, if not impossible, to enter. And at the same time, Japanese companies were making gaining large market share in the U.S. market. And we, the U.S. trade negotiators, would go to Japan and we'd say, "God, you guys are unfair. Our markets are open to you. Your markets are not open to us. You're unfair. And if you don't stop being unfair, we're going to zap you. We're going to impose countervailing duties or quotas on the number of automobiles or other products that you can sell to the U.S." And the Japanese response was, "What are you talking about? Look, our products are high quality. You guys aren't trying hard enough. You put the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. Your quality stinks. Your delivery is always late. Your service is non-existent. You're not trying." And so we get in this Mexican standoff. We would say, "You Japanese are cheating." They would say, "No, you're lazy. You're not trying hard enough." And it went back and forth. And eventually, we negotiated another maneuver in currency, so the yen was revalued against the dollar, and that relieved some of the pressure. But we continued to have these trade frictions. And then we got into what I call the third period of modern globalization, which we're in now, from about 2001 until the present. And 2001 is when China entered the World Trade Organization. When it entered the World Trade Organization, China had a trade surplus with the United States of about $80 billion annually. And of course, the U.S. Congress had to vote whether or not to accept China into the World Trade Organization. And as a result, the president and other U.S. leaders had to go up to the Congress and make their argument. And the argument was that China's tariffs are higher than ours. And so if China is allowed into the World Trade Organization, it will have to make more concessions than we do. And so its tariffs will fall. Our tariffs are already low, so they can't fall very much more. And so the result of this will be that China will make disproportionate concessions, and U.S. exports to China will surge, and this $80 billion trade deficit will go away. Now, you can all look this up. Charlene Barshevsky, Mickey Cantor, other top officials of the Clinton administration and then of the Bush administration testified that letting China into the World Trade Organization was going to dramatically cut this trade deficit with China. Well, today, our trade deficit with China is about $450 billion. Nothing happened in the way that the U.S. officials and in the way that the U.S. economics community had analyzed the trade between China and the U.S. And that brings us, I think, to the situation that we're in today, and it is this. And think about my hiker. The hiker had a whole different idea about condors and how you were supposed to treat them than the judge and the community at large. They weren't thinking the same way, obviously. This is also true of the structure of globalization today. It's interesting. If you look at the very last page, next to last page of The Economist magazine, every edition carries a table of economic statistics. And one of those statistics is the current account deficit and surplus. And what's striking is that the Anglo economies, the Anglo countries, England, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, you could throw in India and South Africa, all have enormous trade deficits, enormous current account deficits. Whereas the Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and in Europe, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, the Netherlands, all have enormous current account surpluses. And that, in my view, reflects a different concept of how globalization and international markets work. China, for example, right now is pursuing a policy in which the government will take stakes in some of the top high-tech Chinese companies like Alibaba, Tencent, WeChat. The Chinese government is going to turn them into state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises. China having already established a large position of state-owned enterprises. Korea, Japan, other East Asian countries continue to pursue quasi-mercantilist industrial and trade policies. And so the bottom line is that we have countries playing different games. There are different concepts of what free trade is and of what globalization is and of how it should operate. And there's a clash between those concepts. The Anglos are kind of on one side and the rest of the world on the other, with various players kind of in the middle. But I think that's the fundamental element of globalization today with which trade negotiators and economic policymakers are struggling. And so I think the question for officials dealing with globalization is, what does globalization taste like? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Ferry, and I'm with an organization called the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and we are a group of manufacturers, companies like Nucor Steel and hundreds of small manufacturers, farm organizations like the National Farmers Union, and labor unions like the AFL-CIO, all members of the CPA. And what pulls us all together is we're all very concerned about foreign trade and restoring American prosperity. And we speak for 4 million Americans, and I'd like to speak to you a little bit this morning about our view of globalization and foreign trade. You've already heard Clyde and Dan talk about the continuity of globalization and that the trend that began hundreds of years ago and continues. I'd like to talk about some of the differences between the globalization that we know from the previous period after the Second World War that Dan talked about and globalization today. Sorry, I'm going to need to read from some of this. So, and I'm also going to have some slides very soon. It's going to feel a bit like an economics lecture, and I apologize for that. Okay, so there are huge differences between globalization now and globalization in the immediate post-war era. Back after 1945, countries like Germany and Britain were advanced nations that had been made poor by the war. Once they recovered, they adopted similar attitudes to trade and real wages that we have in the United States. In other words, trade was fair and real wages grew rapidly. Also, the cost of travel and communication made it economic to keep much more production local. Today, integration makes more economic sense than local production. Politicians and commentators often overlook the crucial differences between globalization or free trade in the 1950s and 60s and today. Perhaps the best example of that is the comment by President Clinton in the early 1990s about NAFTA, when he said NAFTA would turn Mexico into a nation of 120 million consumers. He was probably thinking of how Germany had changed from a bombed-out wasteland in 1945 to a modern nation today, where if you go to Germany, all you see are Mercedes and BMWs angling for parking places. But Mexico has not turned into a nation of consumers. Far from it. And I'd like to talk about some of the downsides of globalization and some of the economic reasons why globalization has not delivered for the US, Mexico, or many other countries what free trade delivered previously. The first thing I want to talk about is free trade theory. Free trade's become the religion of mainstream US economists. They support it blindly, in spite of the facts and in spite of the internal inconsistencies in their own arguments. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard or read economists and others declare that free trade between nations will always lead to greater efficiency, lower prices, and higher incomes for all trading partners. Back in 1941, two economists, Wolfgang Stolper and Paul Samuelson, published a famous paper in trade theory putting forward the famous Stolper-Samuelson theorem. What this theorem said was that if two nations traded with each other, trade could lead to new prices that could actually reduce the return to one factor and therefore reduce the level of income for that factor and perhaps for that entire nation. To give you an example, if Kenya was in a trading zone where it was the sole supplier of coffee beans and it suddenly merged its trading zone with another trading zone, including Brazil, the result could be a drop in the price of Kenyan coffee beans that would make Kenyan coffee farmers worse off. The Stolper-Samuelson theory goes further and shows that Kenya's national income could fall as a result of this merger of trading areas, a free trade agreement. This trade is usually called immiserating trade in economics. But you probably didn't hear that term if you studied undergraduate economics, because the free trade religion tends to avoid the mathematical proofs that show where free trade can fall down. Another example of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem in action is, think of a country with very high wages for unskilled labor, the United States of America. Think of a country with low wages for unskilled labor, Mexico. You put those two countries together, the large number of low-paid, unskilled workers in Mexico causes a drop in the pay rates of the unskilled workers in the United States. If there are enough unskilled workers in the United States, it's not only they who will suffer, but the entire economy. So in theory, that could be the result of the NAFTA agreement that was signed in 1994. Let's keep that in mind and look at some numbers in a moment. Okay, I want to talk about wages. You actually don't even need to go as far as Stolper-Samuelson's case to understand how wages could be affected by a free trade agreement or by globalization. In fact, the whole point of globalized free trade is to create a single competitive market, and Dan talked about that. Competition creates efficiency. It does. Competition also drives to a single price. So whether you're a bond trader in New York earning $500,000 a year before free trade or before globalization, or a machinist in Indiana earning $40,000 a year, if you're suddenly competing with hundreds of millions of workers in Mexico, Asia, South America, and elsewhere, you could see your wages go down due to wage convergence. Everybody's wages comes together in a gigantic global market. There's an old Irish joke about the driver who stops on a country road in Ireland and says to the old Irish farmer walking down the road, "Excuse me, I'm going to Cork. Can you tell me how to get to Cork?" And the Irish farmer stops for a second and thinks, and I won't do the brogue because it's been a long time since I've been to Ireland, but he says, "Begorra, son, if I were going to Cork, I wouldn't be starting from here." And you might say that if you were going to create a single globalized market, you might not want to start by being one of the highest paid nations in the world with an $18 trillion economy. And that expresses some of the wage effects I want to talk about. You may know that according to U.S. Commerce Department figures, median household income in 2016 was the same $59,000 that it was in 1999. In 17 years, median household income in the United States did not progress at all. The last time we had that situation was in the Great Depression. Now, why did that happen? Let me move on to, let me show you a slide here. The US version of globalization has actually been worse than globalization as experienced in other countries, and I'm thinking mainly of a country like Germany. We are unfortunate in that we have Mexico as a neighbor to the south. You can see from this data that Mexican wage levels are the worst performers in the OECD. They're the red line at the bottom. They have not risen at all since NAFTA began. In fact, they've dropped a little bit, partly because the peso fell, but mainly because of the nature of the Mexican economy. It is structured in a way that even though industry has boomed, that hasn't gone through to workers. US real wages have gone up a little bit, but the result is that US workers are competing now with Mexican workers. The Mexican system is set up so as not to allow real wages to rise. Therefore, what's going to happen is single competitive market. Here's what's going to happen. In these three sectors, you can see the decline in US real wages. What I've done is I've taken the wages of production workers, I've devalued them by inflation since the peak year after 2000. 2000 is, in my view, the beginning of the era of globalization. Automotive vehicle production workers' wages have fallen by 27% since 2002, in real terms when adjusted for inflation. That is a staggering decline in income. Other industries have fallen less, only 4% in computer and electronics, and smaller amounts in other industries. The automotive industry has borne the brunt of the NAFTA policy of multinationals and US corporations shifting production to Mexico. So when you think about a 27% fall in real wages, it's no wonder that last November, two candidates, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, got a lot of votes by saying, hey, NAFTA is not working. I want to just talk for a moment about the politics of all this. A key element in globalization is what I would call the mass delusion that by ceding control over an economy to multinational corporations, we can somehow do an end run around deep-seated political and social problems in some nations. The experience of Mexico is a good example. NAFTA has come and enriched the factory owners and the plutocrats in Mexico. As Lou Dobbs said last night, one of the plutocrats is now a large investor in the New York Times. Good for him. He knows how to make a lot of money. The experience of Mexico shows us that you cannot change a political system through this sort of economic reform. Too often, economists and politicians forget that American economic prosperity is built on the bedrock of a democratic system that we established here in 1787 and continues today. In Mexico, they are unfortunately the heirs of a political system developed in Spain that has a huge deficiency in democracy. Multinational corporations cannot fix that. Only the Mexican people themselves and the Mexican government can address that. But I digress. Let me turn to the effect of globalization on employment. This slide shows the 10 nations with whom the U.S. has its largest bilateral trade deficits as of last year. I'm going to give Mexico a break and talk about China for a moment. According to estimates from a Washington think tank, trade with China since the year 2000 has resulted in the loss of 3.4 million U.S. jobs. U.S. industries that have lost hundreds of thousands of jobs include toys, furniture, apparel, footwear, and electronics. It's becoming commonplace now within the economics profession to describe the effects of the upsurge in China imports as the China shock. The term was invented by Professor David Autor at MIT, and they've produced a series of articles that show the effects of the China shock. They hit mainly smaller towns and cities all across America and in places like Texas and the South and the industrial Midwest. The period of employment can last as long as 10 years, and even when people get jobs after losing their jobs in their original industry, there's greater job churn. There's an increased incidence of applying for federal disability benefits, increased incidence of people dropping out of the labor force, and most tragic of all, what they've noticed in these communities statistically, there's a reduction in the number of marriages that happen, And it's documented that women, including women with children, choose not to get married in these communities at a higher rate because the men have an uncertain future of earning. And all that's happened as a result of the China shock. Now, those of you who've studied economics will recall that the theory of comparative advantage tells us that if another nation is more efficient at producing and exporting certain goods, then workers in the importing nation will move into new industries, leading to higher total productivity and higher national income. There are two problems with this economic theory. The first is that there's a transitional period. Professor Rauter showed that period could be 10 years. If you have a 10-year transition, you may never get to the period where there's a new industry and new growth. So all of those communities, in other words, all the areas outside of the two coastlines, could suffer. That's the first problem. The second problem is more simple. What if there are no new industries? What if we've pushed men and women out of apparel, toys, electronics, steel, automotive, and machine tools, and there are no higher value industries for them to go into? Sounds strange, right? Sounds counterintuitive. It is the way that the Asian countries that Clyde was referring to that run trade surpluses think. They think there are industries that we should have our people in because those are growth industries, and the other industries don't matter. If they're right and we're wrong, and we get the industries that are left over, we are a slow growth nation. Have a look at this slide. The red line from the top is manufacturing employment. It was 18 to 20 million for most of my childhood, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. After 2000, it collapsed by 5 million, and today there are 12 million plus manufacturing employees in the United States. The blue line shows employees at food and drink places, retail, restaurants, and fast food places. That line is pushing 12 million. Most economists expect in a couple of years we will have more Americans working in food and drink establishments than in manufacturing. Now here's the problem. Look at the figures below. Manufacturing, as of August data from the BLS, average hourly earnings were $26 an hour. Average hours per week were 40 hours. The average manufacturing worker was earning $1,000 a week. I'm sorry we cut off some of the bottom of the slide there, but what the numbers tell us is that in the food and drink industry, the average hourly earnings are just under $14 an hour, and the average hours per week are about 26 hours. You do the math, and the average worker in that industry is earning $365 a week. So if you had a manufacturing job, you might have been earning $1,000 a week. You went to the food and drink business, and now you're earning $365 a week. And I won't say anything about benefits because I think everybody in this room knows how the benefit situation works. So imagine if you're a single person taking a 66% pay cut. Now imagine if you've got kids and you're trying to support kids on a 66% pay cut, and an economist tells you free trade means that everybody moves into a better, more high productive job. Well, you know, I think I know how I would vote if an economist told me that, and I'm an economist. Okay, let me move on to talk about inequality. Globalization's led to increased inequality, and to my surprise, Citibank, an investment bank, just published a study on inequality documenting that the situation is bad. They're very worried, as an investment bank with lots of rich customers, that inequality could lead to populism, which could lead to high taxes on the rich. So, they're a great Wall Street institution. They put their cards on the table, and they tell us how deep the problem is. And you can see here that in the US, inequality has jumped significantly, as it's jumped in almost every country they looked at. Here's another closer look at US inequality. In the US, real GDP has risen. As Dan said, income's gone up in this country. The problem is more and more of our GDP is going on health, education, and corporate profit, so it's not translating through to personal income. That's problem number one, a sort of structural problem in the economy. Problem number two is income distribution. The top 20% of our population has seen income rise 82% since 1967. The second quintile has seen a significant rise. The other three quintiles, 60% of the population, are roughly flat since 2000. and down in some cases. So we've got a growing inequality problem, which is storing up political problems for us. Finally, I want to say something about economic growth. How much time do I have? 3 minutes. Okay, great. So, and Clyde referred to this, I think, when he compared Anglo countries to Asian countries. In the long run, nothing is more important than the rate of economic growth. If income per person rises by 3% a year, then standards of living double in a generation. The American dream is alive and well, and all is good. But if income per person rises by 0.5% a year, as we've seen recently, and on top of that, if we shift all of that growth to the top 20% of the income distribution, then the other 80% is not happy. Dissent and hostility grow. Politics takes on a nasty tone. Americans lose faith in our desire or our ability to play a leading role in the world. The U.S. has run trade deficits for 41 years now. There's no record anywhere in the history of the world of a nation running trade deficits consistently for 41 years. The effects of all those trade deficits and the rising level of imports behind them is to hollow out U.S. industry and rob us of the high-paying, rising productivity jobs in the best, fastest-growing industries. Free traders like to tell us that the trade deficit doesn't matter because we're getting goods from foreign nations at lower prices than we ever could afford to produce for ourselves. And they're right about that point. Free trade enables low prices. But remember the old saying, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. You teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. I was in North Carolina a few weeks ago talking to people in the western part of the state. And I was talking about the furniture industry, and I mentioned in the 1990s, Walmart arrived, cheap Chinese furniture. Everybody went to Walmart and said, this is great, the prices are great. You fast forward 20 years, and what you find is that in North Carolina, all the furniture factories are shut. The main streets are boarded up. These people don't have jobs. When I put up the slide and talked about how much you earn in a fast food restaurant, their heads were nodding. They got the message. Prices do matter. I hear that all the time. But strong, growing industries matter more. And industries for the future matter not just to us, because I'm getting on a little bit. They matter to my daughter and to the children she's going to have. And here's the proof. This is the economic proof of what Clyde referred to. On the x-axis is the level of trade surplus, current account surplus. On the y-axis is the long-term economic growth rate. The successful countries are in the upper right portion of this graph, and the less successful countries, like the United States and the United Kingdom, are down there towards the left with growth of under 1%. Singapore is way up at the right. Singapore has run a trade surplus every single year since 1990, sometimes a huge trade surplus. Singapore has a larger income per head than the United States of America. Singapore also has a larger manufacturing sector as a share of GDP than the United States of America, so don't think it's a financial center. I used to work in the optical networking industry. My eyes were opened when I went to Singapore, and colleagues of mine said, oh, they're poaching our executives all the time. They are aiming to be a big player in optical networking because it's crucial to the future of the internet. So, you know, what I would say is that economic growth depends on a sound trade policy, and we in this country are far from having that. If I can just conclude with one last slide, I don't want to sound gloomy, and I apologize if I have sounded gloomy, but I do think the economics profession, my profession, is changing. And on this slide, there are quotes from several liberal mainstream economists, all from this year, who've all admitted that they were wrong about trade. One day, maybe you'll be on this slide, Dan. Let me just read.
It's too small to read.
Right, and I'm going to read one quote from Paul Krugman, who won a Nobel Prize for trade economics and for being a free trader in the 1980s and 1990s. And he said earlier this year in a talk in New York City, the thing I really kick myself for missing is workers are a lot less fungible and a lot less mobile and a lot less able to shift jobs than we had imagined or would like to imagine. When all the export-oriented workers in some Midwestern town have lost their jobs, that matters. The effects are bigger. So people are waking up. Even economists are looking up from their mathematical models and starting to face reality. Now we need to get down to the gritty, hard work of developing a post-globalization economic strategy to restore U.S. economic prosperity and bring the American dream back to life. I believe it can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for your presentations. We do want to take questions from the audience. However, maybe we could start with just a couple of minutes if any of the panelists would like to respond to any of the other panelists' comments. Just a couple of minutes, and then we'll open the floor for audience questions. Dan Griswold.
Yes, thank you, Tim. Well, I could spend another half an hour responding to everything. I did, as Tim mentioned, I wrote a book when I was at the Cato Institute called Mad About Trade. I just suggest you take a look at it because I systematically address every point that's come up here. But let me just focus in on one or two. Jeff, I'm pleased that you mentioned Singapore as your model. Singapore is a totally free trade country, totally open. They have virtually no tariffs on anything. Jeff said there isn't a single country that's had trade deficits for 40 years. Actually, there are a few, Australia being one of them. Australia has higher annual trade deficits than we do. They're also the happy country that I don't think has had a major recession in those 40 years. They're a successful country. Neoclassical trade theories gotten banged over the head. Check out Doug Irwin's book, Against the Tide, An Intellectual History of Free Trade. You'll see that all the Stopper-Samuelson theorem is based on some very limited, kind of exotic assumptions, and most economists see it as a textbook example, but not having much effect in the real world. Cato recently published, the Cato Institute, where I used to work, every year they do an economic freedom of the world study. They measure economic freedom in a lot of things, including freedom to trade. And they find consistently that nations that are open to trade, open to the global economy, have higher incomes and achieve higher rates of growth. Two more things quickly. Mexico, and nobody knows Mexico in the United States better than the people of Texas. Mexico is not the same country it was 30 years ago. They have problems in Mexico with unions and state-owned enterprises. NAFTA has been good for Mexico. They have a stable, growing middle class. After 70 years of one-party rule, Mexico is a lively, multi-party democracy. I think NAFTA has played a role in that. And finally, about jobs, and again, I wrote a whole chapter on this. We're a service economy. Just about everybody in this room makes your living in the service economy. You're not flipping hamburgers. Most job growth is not only in the service sector, but in sectors that have high wages, business and professional services, finance, healthcare, education. The choice isn't a manufacturing job or flipping burgers. It's educate ourselves and our children to fill the jobs being created today and tomorrow, not looking back on some nostalgic past that wasn't all that great anyway.
Thank you, Dan. Okay. With that, I think we'll open the floor for questions. We have students again with microphones. Please wait for the mics, and we'll bring it to you. And you may ask your question of any of the panelists or all of them.
Good morning. I'm wondering if any of the panelists have looked at the impact of diversity versus a homogeneous population on how easy it is for countries to readjust and refocus as the global economy has changed.
Well, I don't think that I haven't, and I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at the issue of readjustment based on diversity of population. But I think that there are differences. Dan mentioned, for example, Singapore. I've spent a lot of time in Singapore. Singapore can adjust more easily to economic difficulty than the United States. One reason, of course, is because it's only 4 million people. It's not really a country, it's a city-state. But another reason is because the Singaporean government actively intervenes in the economy in a variety of ways. So when there's a downturn, the Singapore government calls in the labor leaders. And it says, hey guys, no raises this year. It then becomes very active in sending agents to the United States to recruit new investment. So, while it's true that Singapore has low tariffs and rates high on the scale that Dan mentioned of economic freedom, the fact is that the Singaporean government intervenes in the economy in a variety of ways that are at odds with free trade thinking, but that seem to work for Singapore. Singapore, systematically, the Economic Development Board of Singapore analyzes global economies and global corporations. And it approaches companies that it thinks would be good to have in Singapore, and it offers them tax benefits. So if you come to Singapore, we'll build the infrastructure and no taxes for 25 years, utilities at half cost. And so it effectively subsidizes capital investment and tries to attract investment away from other countries to come to Singapore in an aggressive and active way. And that makes it easier for them to adjust to economic disruption. The same is true of a number of other countries. This gets back to the point I was trying to make, that we have two different concepts of globalization. One concept of globalization is epitomized by Singapore, for example, apparently is for free trade because there's low tariffs. But Singapore also manipulates its currency. When it looks like the Singapore trade surplus might fall, Singapore devalues its currency. They intervene in the market to devalue the currency. So this one concept of globalization is that the government is actively involved in dealing with currency policy, investment policy, and so forth to assure that transitions are made smoothly. The other concept of globalization, epitomized by, as I said, the Anglo countries, is that the government's hands-off faith that the market will adjust everything smoothly. There's a clash between those two concepts of globalization. That clash has been becoming more intense over the past 40 years, and because of the impact of China, it's a clash that's reaching far beyond economics and into national security policy.
Okay, year after year, I teach economics and hundreds of students are taking my classes. I wonder, since they are running trade deficit against me, should they start students' first program and impose tariffs on me?
Yeah, it's the personal example. I run a huge trade deficit with the grocery store. They never asked me to come and give a lecture on free trade there, but somehow the dollars work around. Look, we could talk a lot about the trade deficit. The flip side of the trade deficit is a capital surplus. That's why I mentioned early on 500,000 Texans working for foreign-owned companies. Where does Samsung and Toyota get the dollars to invest in those factories in Texas and around the country? More than 6 million Americans working for foreign-owned affiliates, 2 million of them in manufacturing. They get it by selling into our market. The dollars come out, about $4 trillion flow out of the United States each year to buy goods and services and invest abroad. Virtually every one of those $4 trillion flows back pretty quickly to buy our goods and services and also to invest in the United States. So we've got problems in this country, but they're not going to be solved by raising barriers to trade and investment.
Can I provide a slightly different perspective on the trade deficit? We as a nation are running a $500 billion a year trade deficit. That means we're borrowing $500 billion from foreigners every year to support our consumption habits. It might not be so bad if we were investing that $500 billion in future productive capacity, but we're not. With the Fed's policy of low interest rates, we're investing it in all the things you hear about, the financial sector, healthcare, things that may be good in themselves but can't pay for themselves. What has happened to every empire in the past is they borrow a lot of money, and at some point the rest of the world says, we no longer want to lend you any money. And then there's an economic crisis, and then the empire ends. I studied economics in Britain. The tale of the decline of the British Empire is exactly that, and it's not that long ago. I have no doubt that that will happen to the United States if we turn 40 years of trade deficits into 60 years, 80 years, and 100 years. And only the other day, I read in the newspaper that the Chinese government is now negotiating with the Saudis about paying their oil bills in yuan, not in dollars anymore. It hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. Think about that. If the entire oil market moves from the US dollar to the Chinese yuan, what that means for demand for the dollar goes down, what that means for demand for US Treasury bonds goes down, and what that means for the American century, I think you can all conclude.
Let me just add one comment, which is to the professor. It's true that your students run a trade deficit with you, and actually those students are, they're impoverished. If they had to live off of the arrangement, they wouldn't be your students. But their parents or somebody is paying the bill, and so they're able to withstand that deficit. But if you were actually operating on a straight-out economic basis, the students wouldn't be there.
I think we have one more question. Time for one more? Right over here.
Yeah, this is Hassan Saeed. I'm from Austin Peay, from Clarksville, Tennessee. The economists without economic backgrounds, they are just actors. And I like today's versus yesterday's. The U.S. is based on the corporate structure of it is based on a stockholder, and the stockholders are the owners. Other countries, they have different kinds of stakeholders. Japan, Germany, they have bondholders and others as stakeholders, consumers, and even the government. In the United States, there are some service organizations that are turning into private enterprises. Hospitals, for example, they are now owned by stockholders. For those three economists that are on the panel, I would like to see their point of view with regard to ownership for healthcare industry, using the form of corporate America, and also forgetting about the consumer side, and also the government, who sometimes look at economics as a sideshow and look at only politics instead of really economics that based on theory and also practice successful. Thank you.
Well, let me take a crack. I think that that's an excellent point that the questioner has made, and it goes to the heart of the issue I've been trying to raise here today, which is the form of globalization and the clash between forms of globalization. And he's completely right. The stakeholders in various economies are quite different. He mentioned Germany. In Germany, corporations have a supervisory, they have two boards, a supervisory board and a management board. The management board is the board of directors consisting of the chief officers of the corporation. The supervisory board is the oversight board, which includes some of the office of the corporation, but it also includes the labor unions, importantly, and it includes outside players. And you know, the result has been that whereas in the U.S. the focus of corporations is very strongly on making money now and very strongly on the stock price and the financial aspects of the business, because of the nature of its board, the German corporation takes a longer-term, broader societal view of how it should be acting and how it should be investing. If you go to a country like China, I mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, this is not even the government, but the party is now pursuing a policy that party members need to be in the governing bodies of the corporations. And of course we know that many countries, China leading, but many other countries, have state-owned enterprises. That's a different stakeholder, and that stakeholder views trade and investment in a strategic way and in a broad way rather than in an administrative efficiency way, which characterizes the theory of American business and trade. And so, yes, the nature of the stakeholder is a very critical factor.
Thanks for bringing up that question. Let me put in a good word for the Anglo-Saxon model. I think it's held up pretty well. The shareholder corporation has served Western civilization pretty well for 400 years or so. I think if you look at those Anglo-Saxon nations, Great Britain, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, we remain among the freest, most prosperous nations in the world. The rest of the world has been moving towards our model. I remember back in the 1980s when people were warning us about the Japanese model and they were going to steamroll us. Well, they didn't. And I think a lot of the hand-wringing about China and other countries today is equally mistaken. Mark my words, the China shock was a one-time 7 or 8 year transition. China's now becoming more of a normal country. They're running into their own demographic headwinds. China's going to face some of the same problems Japan had. I'll just end with this. The last 30 years, we've had an experiment. The last 100 years, central planning, government central direction versus the free market. The free market won. Let's not imitate the people who lost.
Yeah.
Okay,
Finally, some concluding comments from Jeff Ferry.
I'll try to make a quick final comment. I certainly don't support central planning. I do, however, support a model like we've spoken about, Singapore, where the government sets the terms and says trade surpluses and growth industries matter. Now you, the free market sector, get on with it. As far as shareholder democracy and shareholders, I do support shareholder democracy, absolutely, and the shareholding system. But we do have to be aware that there's more and more pressure on corporations to be shorter and shorter term. And China is gaining on us quickly. And when we look at, for instance, the steel industry, China is now more than 50% of world steel production. There are key elements in our military, I'm talking about ships and planes and vehicles, where the components cannot be manufactured here. We need to import them. And if you take a long-term view, it is possible there will be a war again somewhere someday, and the government and the private sector need to be aware of that and take a long-term view. With China, we have an adversary in the world that's a different kind of nation from previous adversaries. I'll just mention a joke some of you may know. Deng Xiaoping, who basically invented the current Chinese system, which is capitalism in communist clothes, was asked once back in the 1990s whether he thought the French Revolution was a success. He thought for a moment, and his answer was, "It's a little too soon to tell." So I think that expresses how the Chinese view the challenge of the 21st century, and I think it's incumbent upon us to take that kind of view as well.
Thank you, Jeff. Please join me in thanking our panel.